So, it's like 2 a.m. Can't sleep. So I'm going to record Grixis Shadow content instead. Played their league yesterday, day before, something like that. Finally getting around to doing the voiceover because we got the Izzet League up. If you want to go check that out. Not the Izzet League, the Izzet Top 16 in the Modern Challenge. A little bit fancier. So that's up in one of the previous videos. I've been messing around with like YouTube settings. For example, once you get to the end of the video, the last like 30 seconds, you'll have some suggestions show up where you can like go check out a similar video from me or stuff like that. Pretty cool. I've been adding tags to videos so they're easier to find. Now, if you like are on YouTube or something, Googling around, and you Google Sultai Death Shadow, then even the streams that don't have Sultai Death Shadow in the title, you'll still be able to get to them. But all of that wouldn't be possible if I didn't have the motivation brought to me by you guys who have been liking videos, commenting on things, subscribing to the channel, coming and checking out the Twitch content, all that. So thank you all so much for being so supportive as always. But I'm sure you don't want to hear about all that. Instead, you want to hear about Grixis Shadow and what I've got going on with that. So let's go ahead and hop into the matches so you can see like what my kind of build's all about. We're seeing this back and forth right now of, I want to play Grixis. Am I playing Murktide? Am I not playing Murktide? Am I playing Gigantha? No Gigantha. Counterspell? No Counterspell. So instead of worrying about all that, I'm going to play Grixis how I like to play Grixis. And my current Grixis build is following a lot of the stuff that's given me a lot of success with Jund Shadow recently. More specifically, things like the 4 copies of Orcish Bowmaster, which is pretty stock. The 3 Fable of the Mirror Breakers, 2 Kroxa, Terminate in the main, this little Unholy Heat Lightning Bolt mix-up. And then the blue for Expressive Iteration, Drown and Lock, Spell Pierce, Dress Down out of the board. So it's a lot more of a kind of incremental value Grixis Shadow, really trying to leverage like Fable into Kroxa or Iteration into Fable into Kroxa. Get there with a little bit of extra spot removal spells early on. Get those Terminate in the main, extra Terminate in the board. Get access to the full set of Bowmasters, the Drown and the Locks. To try to leverage our ability to get to the mid to late game and then really have Kroxa take over from there. Obviously, like Fable Shadow can do some heavy lifting as well. But if the game gets past a certain point, then Kroxa just becomes like a phenomenal top deck. Fable becomes a phenomenal top deck. Iteration. So just kind of maxing out on those haymakers that we can get to later. In the sideboard, a couple copies of Dress Down. Great against Hardened Scales. Great against anything with ETB abilities. Great against Urza Saga decks. 3rd Spell Pierce to go with the 2 in the main. 2 copies of Flusterstorm for the Cascade stuff. 2 Turok Dread Cantor, 2 Alpine Moon, a Terminate, 2 Engineered Explosives, an Unlicensed Hearse, and a Nihil Spellbomb. Ultimately, I would like to be a little better against Blood Moon decks, kind of like we are with Jund, but with so much of the blue being necessary in this deck, with like Iteration, Drown in the Lock, it is a lot more difficult to run actual Blood Moon, which is why we're on Alpine Moon instead, where a lot of the times with Jund, you'll see actual Blood Moon in that spot. But you take what you can get. We'll run through it regardless, kind of show off some of the matches. You can make a decision for yourself as to whether this is the kind of Grixis build maybe you want to try out. Maybe it's not for you. You want to just chunk it aside onto the next thing. So round number 1, we are on the draw. Bit of a slow hand, but it's got some pop to it. Turn 1, Ragavan off of Stomping Ground, so I'm expecting either like Teamer, some of the new Questing Druid builds, or Nope. Zoo. Wasn't expecting Zoo. Not off of Stomping Ground. Usually with Zoo, you see the non-Stomping Ground shocks, which unfortunately Scion Draco is a card we have a lot of problems with here if we don't find another Unholy Heat. But probably even if we find an Unholy Heat, it's not going to be enough in the face of Scion, Goyf, and Wild Nicottle. So let's just go to game 2. Sideboarding, pretty minimalist. Bowmaster, really not too good. Just bringing in copies of Dress Down to help deal with like Territorial Kavu, take the flying off Scion, and then extra Terminate. So not a ton coming in and out. Dress Down's a good pickup. Croaks is a good pickup. Opponent not having a 1-drop is it's nice. And then here, this was probably a little too passive. Like I probably could have just gone into their turn, Dress Down, untap, play Croxa. But kind of my problem with it was if they just had something like Leyline Binding, I get no value out of Croxa. And then I was expecting them to use a Bolt or a Tribal Flames on the Shadow. I didn't really expect them to use a Stomp off a Bone Crusher Giant. So that was more value than I really intended to give my opponent that turn. But either way, we get to escape Croxa, have that to potentially punch through some damage if we just get to untap with Drown. Unfortunately, our opponent does have Lightning Bolt EOT into untap Tribal Flames. So we had to take a little more damage from our lands than I wanted to. Part of that was because the turn that they dashed the Ragavan, I tapped a little poorly in a way that I had to fetch and shock to be able to kill the Ragavan when I could have like fetched earlier, played the Croxa, and held up my red mana and not needed to fetch and shock. So I took a couple extra points that were kind of unnecessary there. But either way, get that one out of the way. On to match number 2. Another Stomping Ground opponent. So I was kind of thinking some Zoo variant again, but I think the likelihood of running into 2 Stomping Ground Zoo lists is pretty low. Thankfully, the Fire and Ice kind of gives away that it's Rhinos instead of Zoo. Opponent passing the turn into our Polluted Delta, so maybe afraid of a Spell Pierce or something on a Violent Outburst. Let's see if we can bring up their hand. There we go. So they did have a Shardless Agent and chose not to cast it and hold up Mystical Dispute instead. Kind of an interesting choice. But either way, they are going to get to Shardless Agent as I decided to take the Mystical Dispute to make sure I could get down a Shadow. I was ultimately like 2 Shadows are pretty good in the face of 2 Rhinos. They could have gone for the subtlety to bounce the Shadow, but instead decided not to. Evoke a Fury off the Dead and Gone is even better because now they don't have a way to get the Shadow off the board currently. And then they make one of everybody's favorite attacks where they're just going to go in, try to trade off with a Shadow and learn very quickly that that's not going to work out the way that they want it to. Instead, we get to eat both Rhinos. They have a Murktide as their last card in hand, but my attack is going to guarantee a chump block on the Murktide. They have no cards, so all I have to do is stand in front of this Shardless Agent. And so pick up a Fable is actually really good because I get to put 2 bodies on the battlefield, or 3 bodies with Fable, Bowmaster, and the token, and make sure that they don't have an option to attack through. So definitely one of the benefits of playing a Shadow deck, if you're expecting a bunch of Rhinos, is the fact that most of your threats just get bigger than Rhinos. Sideboarding, Bowmaster's really not doing a lot. Ragavan can come out pretty easy. Boarding in Engineered Explosives, Fluster Storm, any extra Spell Pierce, Mystical Dispute, stuff like that. If you're running Chalice of the Void instead of Gigantha, that would come in. But I think I just went like 2 EEs, 2 Fluster Storm, Spell Pierce, and Terminate. Just an extra answer to a Rhino. You can board out some number of Lightning Bolts as well. Basically anything that doesn't actually kill a Rhino or get bigger than a Rhino is kind of disposable. So, opponent Cyclone Aloran revealed could go for a Rhinos that turn and chooses not to. So I kind of assume that they're going for this line again of Mystical Dispute. I don't really know why they're like so all in, so gung-ho on Mystical Disputing instead of putting Rhinos in play. But power to them, I guess. Go for Escape Kroxa. Either they're going to have another Mystical Dispute or a Subtlety. If they have a Subtlety, I can bolt. So that's kind of okay. Think I end up putting the Kroxa back on top. Because I kind of figure I've got a bunch of stuff. Yeah, I've got a bunch of stuff to just throw out there. And my opponent's kind of playing like they don't have a copy of Violent Outburst in hand. So I'm just going to play slow and get to Kroxa again, hopefully. And then finally, like, opponent gives me enough time to find a Drown in the Loch. So now even if they do find a Cascade spell, I've got it covered. Let them bounce my token, because ultimately the token doesn't really matter. Ditch the extra Kroxa. Do need to drown this Brazen Borrower, unfortunately, but if my opponent does end up with like another Rhinos, or they end up with the first Rhinos, then I do just have the ability to escape Kroxa. And then if my opponent doesn't hit Rhinos, then I'm in this weird spot where I could potentially untap and double Spell Pierce a Footfalls. It's not like a super reliable plan, but it's a non-zero plan. Since they hit a land here, I can actually add Gigantha to my hand and hold up double Pierce. Doesn't stop a Rhinos, but at the same time, with Kroxa out, if they do top deck a Rhinos, they die to the attack trigger. So, Kroxa. Eventually, people are going to stop sleeping on him. Match number 3. On the play, Thoughtseize into Kroxa. Pretty good opener. Turns out, with Force Negation Fire and Ice, we were up against Rhinos again. Once more, for a second time, we find ourselves against the Rhino Menace. But because of that force, our opponent is down a couple cards, which makes Kroxa even better. So it's already gotten 8 power out of our opponent's hand with just that one Violent Outburst. Then pretty okay just going ahead and getting Fable down. Mostly because if my opponent untaps and plays like a Shardless Agent here, I can get the attack trigger off the Goblin plus Drown Terminate to kill the 2 Rhinos. So I'm not like into the world if they get some down. If they pass the turn like this and try to like Violent Outburst on my turn for whatever reason when they see blue, then I do have access to Drown in the Loch. Unless they have another what's it called? Force negation. So decide to just hold up my mana, go for the drown. I think opponent got like in their own head a little bit here with the whole passing the turn and trying to instep the violent outburst instead of just resolving it on their turn. But regardless, we got some Rhinos. We can fatal push, or not fatal push, terminate one of those. Save a little life. Flip over our reflection. Iteration finds another Croxa, which we could play, but instead we're just going to offer to like trade up this goblin token for the Rhino. And when our opponent doesn't take the trade, then we just escape the Croxa. Now we can like lightning bolt the Shardless Agent if we want. Maybe opponent finds an answer to our Croxa. That'd be okay too. Looks like they're just passing. So they better have a bounce effect or something for the Croxa, which if they're letting me go to combat means they probably don't. Just jumping with the Shardless Agent, that's fine. And then they do find a Fury, so they're able to take out our tokens. Unfortunately, they decide to go to combat, which means we get to just bolt the Fury, untap, and attack through for lethal with the Croxa. So Croxa ended up doing 6, 9, 12, either 12 or 15 damage this game, which is like stood in front of a Rhinos, which is a lot of the reasons that I like it over cards like Underworld Breach. We already talked about Rhino sideboarding, so you can see why the game or the potential first hand with triple Fable probably isn't what I want. But a hand with Spell Pierce is really good. Get down Ragioli, pass the turn. I probably need to get better about just fetching up like Blood Crypt for this Ragavan instead of water or instead of Steam Vents. Because like if I top deck a Thoughtseize, it's a lot worse for Shadow. But I figure it's going to be a minute before the Shadow matters anyway, so. But yeah, Croxa being able to ditch some cards early can make draws awkward. Very reasonable body when it hits the battlefield. Got an upkeep Violent Outburst into a Spell Pierce. They got the Force Negation, so all trade-offs. Kind of want to fire off this iteration in case I'm able to find an EE, but Shadowline probably a little bit better. Like, it makes my opponent's attacks really awkward unless you're like my opponent and just jam anyway. Now, I should have reordered my blockers and presented the Shadow first. I don't think it matters, but just in case they decided to like assign all the damage to the Shadow, there's a chance the Ragavan lived. But so it's like really, really minor. Like I said, I don't think it matters. We'll fetch down to 5. We're able to terminate a Rhino. What I'm hoping is that our opponent attacks in, we terminate a Rhino, we block a Rhino, take 4, go to 1, and then maybe from there find something else to do to kind of swing things in our favor. And unfortunately, they just have a Murktide. So we kind of snap, go straight to combat. Because I want them to chump with the Murktide, even though I don't have anything for the Rhino. But my plan was kind of, if I drew something good, just snap, go to combat, see if I could get them to block with the Murktide, and then have like a removal spell for the Rhino. So it's nice to know that the plan would have worked if I drew something good there. Regardless, game 3, we get to be back on the play, but with a Gemstone Cavern on the other side, it doesn't really feel like the play. Very much feels like we're on the draw. On the draw, but our opponent mulliganed. Fire the Ragavan. That's fine. We've got Thoughtseize. We've got Spell Pierce. Thoughtseize away this Shardless Agent. Spell Pierce in case they top deck another Shardless Agent or a Violent Outburst. And then we're just hoping to hit a land here, which thankfully we do. So we're going to be able to drop down a Fable. Again, we got to dodge a Violent Outburst this time, but I think resolving the Fable is more important. They do find a Violent Outburst, which, you know, we all knew it was going to happen. Their hand is a Subtlety and an Unknown currently. They did cycle the Lorien Revealed. Thoughtseize off the top is okay, but I think I'd rather ditch it away for a threat. Alas, our threat comes in the form of another Thoughtseize. But we are able to kill a Rhino, attack, create a treasure, terminate the other Rhino, Spell Pierce the Dead and Gone so we can get our combat on. And then we know their last card is Subtlety. So we just have to find something that either outclocks the Subtlety or kills it. A Scalding Tarn does not outclock or kill it. We can't Thoughtseize because they just flash in the Subtlety in response. We can't attack because they just flash it in and block. So we need our opponent to whiff. We need to find something because we can only hit them for 4. So we're not outracing the Subtlety. Iteration's a pretty good draw. Iteration into removal spells is also a pretty good draw. We couldn't make enough mana to terminate and hold up Drown, so we're just going to fire off the terminate, hope they didn't find a force, which they did not. So now we're just never going to tap off Drown in the lock. Like, Drown is a hard counter for everything they can have except for exactly Murktide. So we're gonna sit on that. Hit our opponent in the face. We could play a Gigantha, but I would have to fetch and shock down to 2 and put myself dead to Fire and Ice. And I have no intention of putting myself dead to something if I can control it. Like, I'll fetch to 4 because I can kill a Questing Beast. Technically, I could counter a Fire and Ice, but I don't want to give my opponent the chance of runner. Get to hit them down to 2 here. If they had a removal spell for the Goblin token, I just let that resolve and play out Gigantha. That way I could just guarantee they untap, I counter whatever they draw, and win from there. It's like no reason to fight over something that would kill one of the token, even in response to the Kiki activation. So we draw. EE is pretty good for Rhinos. So now if they did have like a shardless agent, we could counter the agent itself, let the footfalls resolve, untap EE away the footfalls and our treasure tokens and attack in for lethal. So on to match number 4. We're up 2-1 in the league. Always feels good to be positive. Opponent off Plains Esper Sentinel. So assuming Hammertime, we do have this Bowmaster to go ahead and ping down the annoying artifact human. Boop. Little boop on his robotic snoot. Sigarda's Aids got the Inkmoth Nexus, so we don't want to tap off of our lightning bolt if we don't have to. But we do want Shadow down to improve our clock. So opponent fired off the Inkmoth and then went for the Stoneforge. I'm guessing they kind of thought about it like, oh, I don't really want to risk dying to a spot removal spell. So we'll take the Strip Mine and then untap and find an Unholy Heat. So we know we get to kill off this Stoneforge right away and kind of get back to an even board. I say even board state. It's far from even at this moment. Hit them down to less than half. Stoneforge is fine. We've got a Drown. We've got a Hulk. We'll start off by attacking. So this attack might be a little conservative. I really don't want to leave myself dead if I can help it. So, like, if they have Ginger Brute plus Hammer plus give it hexproof plus, or not hexproof, unblockable, plus a protection spell like a Surge of Salvation, then that's what I lose to. But pretty much anything else I can beat by just holding up Drown in the Lock. So we attack in, make our opponent make the first move, which they decide to go for the Shadow Spear to gain a little bit of life. That's completely okay with me. Here, they fire up the Inkmoth Nexus, cast the Colossus Hammer, and I started thinking like, okay, well, I could counter the Hammer, and this is really important for everybody keeping up at home. I could counter the Hammer. I would lose to a second Hammer. So they would attack. I can't block. They flash in a Hammer. Kill me. I could go to kill the Inkmoth with the Drown in the Lock. I lose to Surge of Salvation. Okay. But then I realized, oh my God, they did this during like their first main phase. So this Inkmoth is going to lose flying. They've already played a land for turn because I strip mined one of their lands earlier on that Inkmoth. I've already played a land for turn, so they have 1 mana available. If they use that 1 mana to give the Inkmoth flying again, I can Drown in the Lock to kill it. If they attack in, I can just chump block with an army token, Drown in the Lock to counter their follow-up play that would chump block Shadow and Ragavan, and then attack in for lethal. If they, I don't know, something else that's not one of those plays, then I deal accordingly. So decide, yeah, you got it. Strap it up. You don't want to give it flying? Cool. Here's a chump block. You don't have a follow-up? Great. So it's just important to think about the timing there. Like, hey, my opponent isn't doing this after blocks. If they had gone to combat, attacked, and I didn't block, and then they flashed in a Hammer, I would probably go for countering the Hammer instead of trying to kill the Inkmoth Nexus, because I haven't put them in a position where they could have had Surge of Salvation and didn't. Every time I killed something, they were tapped out. So they could have a Surge of Salvation in hammer or in hand. They had an opportunity earlier to flash in a hammer to strap up onto the Stoneforge Mystic and block the shadow, and they instead chose to put in a Shadow Spear. I think if they had 2 hammers, they would have flashed in a hammer there. So I'm countering the hammer if they flash it in after combat or after blocks, in the assumption that they don't have another hammer because of that. So on to game 2 against Hammertime. Board ends, EE, extra terminate, stuff like that. Board outs, like a couple Bowmasters. Board in, dress down, board out some Ragavans. Which I saw somebody on the previous video I did, the Izzet video, talking about Ragavan being like one of the best things you can do against Hammertime. And I got to go back through and comment on that one, because maybe it's different for Murktide. But in Shadow, like when you're bringing in EEs and dress downs and stuff, I'd almost always rather have those than Ragavan. So it's a little bit of a personal preference. Decide the iteration here, because if I did whiff, I could still Thought Seize from hand to take the Cauldron. But because I didn't whiff and I hit the Lightning Bolt, then I can just kill off the Stoneforge and leave the Cauldron in hand. If they ended up finding another Stoneforge for like a hammer or something, that I could still Thought Seize them and take something. But instead, we get to kick a Turok, get a Cauldron, a March of Otherworldly Light out of hand. Find ourselves a Kroxa. Get the last card out of hand, pump our Turok. We get a free attack in because our opponent can't make a construct this turn. And then hopefully next turn, especially if we find a land, we can just untap, escape Kroxa, have like a Terminate or a Drown up. A la this. We get to go for the Kroxa. Opponent makes a construct. They do end up finding a Shadow Spear here. So they found like a non-zero piece of interaction. But I can still attack him with Turok. Offer up the trade. If they want to take the trade, I've still got Kroxa and 2 removal spells. If they don't take the trade, then on their turn, they can make a construct. Go find something. Their original construct can get up to a 6/6. But I still have a Kroxa that can block. I did give them the potential, like, blowout of finding a Surge of Salvation there. But since they didn't, I get to have Kroxa. Have my Kroxa and eat my victory too. You know. On to match 5. So this one I thought was pretty fun. We get to start a hand with 4 lands, Bobble Kroxa. About the most unassuming Grixis Shadow hand you could possibly keep. Especially when we draw more lands. But again, we have Kroxa. Opponent starting off Island, Hard Evidence means almost assuredly some sort of creativity list. Ditching Archon to the Kroxa kind of confirms that. Usually don't see Counterspell out of creativity. You see a lot of Spell Pierces. Really not many Counterspells. So that kind of threw me off. Then Iteration really threw me off. So this is like blue-red creativity. This basic Island, Counterspell, Expressive Iteration, Hard Evidence, Narset. I could hold up the Drown in the Loch to try to go for a creativity, but if they didn't have a creativity this turn, I'm assuming they're missing something, which in this case is the land. So that means our one and only thing we can do is escape Kroxa, try to put enough pressure to where we can force some bad interaction before the land hits, before they can creativity. Terminate the token, so not only so Ragavan can hopefully get through, which unfortunately Bolt means it can't, but also because if they do have a creativity, they only have the Dwarven Mine and the Steam Vents as mountains, so another mountain does not, or another fetch land like this does not get an online Dwarven Mine. So I wanted to get the token off the battlefield when I could. Now we've got Spell Pierce to hopefully fight over a creativity. The Gigantha might have been a little greedy because now they could have like land, creativity, Spell Pierce. But when I see Counter Spell in the yard, then I'm kind of assuming they don't have Counter Spell and Spell Pierce, because we just saw Lightning Bolt, Hard Evidence, Narset, Counterspell, Prismari Command, what was it? The Indomitable Creativity itself. Like, there's only so many cards you can have in the deck. So we'll Alpine Moon Creativity, or Alpine Moon Dwarven Mine, just to try to slow down creativity. We've got EE to take out the Clue token and the Crab, if possible. See an Archon on top of our opponent's library. Watery Grave on top of ours that we don't want, so we'll go ahead and shuffle that away. And then I decide here that if my opponent cracks their fetch, I'll go ahead and pop the EE, just take out the draw, take out the Crab. Like, I've got the Dwarven Mine covered. They didn't play another Hard Evidence or something last turn, so I just get to shut off a draw, shut off a token. Counterspell's fine. I did hurt myself pretty bad with an Alpine Moon into a Dwarven Mine one time back when creativity was on Velomachus. And it was because my opponent didn't have white mana, and I ended up Alpine Mooning a Dwarven Mine that gave them white mana to Prismatic Ending something. And so I thought that was kind of funny, but I do think if you can take advantage of the turn or two that Alpine Moon buys you, it's a solid option. Like here, I'm kind of able to take advantage of the chaos with access to Drown in the Lock and Kroxa, things like that, delaying a little bit. Find the land, so we get to escape the Kroxa, hold up the Drown in the Lock, or the EE if they happen to have something like a Prismari command to make a token. Fortunately, all they have is a Through the Breach, so we get to ditch that. Then they decide to creativity my Kroxa, which flips into another Kroxa, which is kind of funny because the only creatures I think I have in the deck right now are Kroxa, Shadow, and a couple Bowmasters. So pretty reasonable chance it was going to flip into something like another Kroxa. So yeah, that was fun little Grixis Shadow League. That loss to Teamer to start it off was loss to Zoo to start it off was a little rough. But ultimately, that is a deck that can out-aggro us pretty well. Kroxa, I thought, was phenomenal the entire league. Every time I play Kroxa, I am thrilled to have it in my list. We saw it do so much work against not only creativity, saw it do a ton of work against the Rhinos opponent. A little less so against Hammertime, but that's also just a fast, interactive kind of combo deck. It can be okay against certain variants of Zoo, but a lot of times they're going to have Territorial Kavu that could exile it or Rest in Peace out of the sideboard. So you do have to be a little bit careful there. What else do I think about the list? Spell Pierce, Drown in the Lock. Still not sure of exact numbers of those I want. I really like Drown in the Loch. I think a lot of people are kind of hesitant on the card, but especially with Kroxa in the deck as another discard outlet, having a potential 2-mana counterspell that's easy on the mana is really, really nice. And then every now and then you just get to like kill something off and feel extra good about it. Obviously, it doesn't look good into things like Scion of Draco, but nothing in the deck really does. The spot removal suite, the 3 bolt, 3 heat, terminate, 3 drown, feels a little all over the place. You could easily swap out, say, the third, like, I guess first terminate for a 4th heat or bolt. You could swap out, if you're really low on Drown in the Loch, then you could swap out those for like 4th bolt, 4th heat, 2nd terminate, or 3rd pierce, something like that. But again, I've liked Drown. The Bowmasters, we didn't see a lot of good Bowmaster matchups this league. It's okay against Hammertime, but pretty bad against Zoo, against Rhinos. Can be okay against Dwarven Mines out of creativity, but all in all, like, not a great league for Bowmaster. So that's one you could consider cutting down to 3. Sideboard I thought was solid. I think we ended up bringing in everything except Nihil Spellbomb at least once. Spellbomb or Hearse. Like, all the Grave Hate, I feel like I go on streaks of leagues where I'll see all of the Grave matchups one league and then board in an extra Spellbomb or 2 and then none of the Grave matchups the next league, and it feels horrible. And there's not really a right or wrong to it. I think Chalice of the Void is kind of the compromise because it's good against Living End and Rhinos. And I think Living End's about the only like graveyard deck you really need to care about the graveyard against. And Chalice kind of gives you a way to care about what the deck is doing without actually caring about the graveyard. And the overlap for Rhinos is certainly appreciated, but losing Giganta is definitely a non-zero factor. So just be careful of that. I think Flusterstorm's like good enough in those matchups. Yeah, I think that's about all I got. As always, if you like the video, like the commentary, feel free to drop a sub on the YouTube channel. Greatly helps us get closer to that 1K goal. I'll have a link to the Twitch down below if you want to come check out a live stream, link to the deck list, link to the Discord and Twitter if you want to come hang out, talk shop about any shadow variants or non-shadow decks, or see other videos like this. Other than that, I hope you all have a fantastic rest of your day. Stay safe, enjoy some good food and company. Catch y'all back live later. Adios for now.